Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. If you could all take your seats. So my name is Alex Friedland. I'm the director of the Janus Fellows. I'm battling a little bit of a cold, so if you can bear with me. Welcome to the Janus Forum Lecture, Colleges in Coal, Should Brown Divest? Thanks for coming. It's an unusual time for us to be holding a Janus lecture. We don't usually start these at 11:30. I just skipped German to make it here, so if anybody asks, I wasn't here. I'd like to thank our three speakers, Bill McKibben, James Rogers, and Christian Parenti, for joining us today. I'd also like to thank the Political Theory Project and the Janus Fellows for organizing this event. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming to join us. It's an unseasonably warm October day. It's really beautiful out there. So thanks for coming inside. Finally, I'd like to thank the students of Divest Coal. Since Brown Divest Coal was founded in September of last year, joining more than 300 sister groups at schools across the country, divestment has become a popular topic on Brown's campus. Brown's corporation plans on voting on divestment in October of this year. This is due in large part to the commitment and determination of Brown's Divest Coal group. Though the Janus Forum often chooses topics based on national or international debates, we're thrilled to be able to discuss an issue with an immediate impact on Brown. The Janus Forum sees itself as a place for conversation and discussion on all scales, and so Brown's role in divestment seems like an obvious topic for us. Part of the difficulty we face in any of our lectures is how we can ensure the discussion is fair and balanced. That sounds Fox Newsy, but we mean it. Being a forum for conversation means ensuring debates are open and balanced, and that there's been some concern over the format of this debate, specifically over the number of speakers and the viewpoints those speakers represent. And in the spirit of openness, we wanted to acknowledge those concerns. It's our belief that the speakers here today represent three distinct viewpoints on the issue of divestment. And like most issues, it's multifaceted and complex. A debate with only two speakers, we thought, didn't do it justice. There's always going to be a temptation to dichotomize any issue that we discuss. You want to split it between left and right, or yes and no. It's really easy to do that. All we need to do is look at the shutdown of the federal government going on right now to realize how dangerous that division can be, these absolute divisions. And though we still do end up inviting only two speakers to most of the events we do, we believe this particular event is too important to Brown's community to risk leaving the discussion incomplete. The Janus Forum is committed to discussing both sides of an issue, or it's not devoted to discussing both sides of an issue. We're committed to discussing all sides of an issue, and it's an important distinction. We incorporate every voice. It doesn't merely challenge our convictions, it strengthens them. We want to make sure Brown's decision to divest or not divest is a good one. We have to own our decision. The Janus Forum believes that this format best helps us to reach that goal. But that doesn't mean we've done this right. We wanted to make sure the audience was aware of the concern over the format of this debate, and that you keep it in mind over the course of the following lecture. We hope you think we've given each side a fair shake, and above all, that you find the following debate meaningful. That's my spiel. I'll introduce the speakers now. If I were to take the time to list the resumes of each of these distinguished men, I'd be up here for an hour. So there's an extended biography in your program. I'll just give a short introduction. We're joined by Bill McKibben, who's on the end here. He's currently the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College. He's an author of a dozen books about the environment and a founder of 350.org. Next, we have James E. Rogers in the middle. He was the CEO of Duke Energy for 25 years and is currently the chairman of its board of directors. He served on the boards of 8 Fortune 500 companies. It's 8 more than me, in case you were wondering. And he currently resides in Charlotte, North Carolina. Finally, we have Christian Parenti here on the end, a professor of sustainable development at the School for International Training. He's a contributing editor at The Nation and an author of 4 books. So the format today is going to be each speaker will take 15 minutes to give opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Normally what we do for Q&A is we hold up mics, but in order to make sure everyone gets the same amount of contributing time, I'm going to ask people who they plan on directing their question to, and we'll break it up that way to make sure everyone gets equal talking time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Parenti for his 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Brown University and to the Janus Forum for inviting us all. It's an honor to be here. The reason I was invited to this was because when Bill McKibben and 350 very successfully and valiantly launched their divestment campaign, I had the bad manners to write what I hoped was a friendly critique. And I should say at the outset that the way that Bill personally and other people at 350 accepted this critique of the divestment strategy was a model of solidarity and professionalism and maturity. And, you know, they were actually open to some of the criticisms and suggestions that I've made. So that's sort of background, why there's three people here, how I'm the third. In answer to and I'll explain what my criticism was of divestment is, and then I'll also give a little critique of my own thinking about that, and make some suggestions about what I think needs to be part of how we think and act around getting off of fossil fuels. And some of that will relate to the record of Duke Energy. As for the question before the House, should Brown University divest from fossil fuels? I say yes, you should divest, but it's not enough. That alone won't have much of a material impact on the fossil fuel industry. And this was the heart of the critique that I made. At first, divestment of fossil fuels was pitched as directly hurting the bottom line of fossil fuel companies. And this was a way to get their attention and get them to change. This was also sometimes discussed as being a response to the failure of government. And government has failed in many ways, but I think it's dangerous to try and go around government and think that we shouldn't use government power to control industry. Because in fact, that is what controls industry today. We forget that because industry pollutes, et cetera, but there are many ways in which industry is heavily regulated. We like to get out from under those regulations, and it's trying very hard to do that. So why was selling fossil fuel stocks not hurt fossil fuel companies? Well, it's because fossil fuel companies make money by selling fossil fuels. Oil companies, coal companies, electrical companies make their profits by selling energy, not by selling stock. As a matter of fact, 70% of the world's fossil fuel reserves are not even owned by private companies, they're owned by governments. One of the largest petroleum servicing companies and one of the most active and vocal members of the sort of climate denial community, if you will, Koch Industries, doesn't even sell stock. They're a privately held company, family company. So you can't divest from them because you can't own them. So they're not going to be impacted by this effort. So then the argument is, well, it's not about hurting their bottom line, it's about revoking their social license to operate, okay? But at one level, fossil fuel companies don't have a social license to operate. Social license to operate comes out of the corporate social responsibility movement, and it essentially boils down to corporate reputation. Every year, the Pew Research Group does a survey of Americans about the top 25 industries in the country, and every year fossil fuel ends up dead last, just below it is government, unfortunately, in terms of people disliking fossil fuels. There's about a 61% disapproval rating of the fossil fuel industry. So they don't really have much of a social license to operate, but more importantly what they have is they have an actual license to operate. They have the legal power to do what they're doing. And they are constrained to some extent by legal power, and they are allowed by legal power to pollute the environment. And I think ultimately that is where all our tactics and strategy has to incorporate a recognition of the fact that, as far as I see it, the only force ultimately that's strong enough to euthanize the fossil fuel industry is government power that can regulate it out of existence. So then the question for our movements is, how do we get to that? And I think there's a role for divestment in that. I'm not opposed to the divestment movement. I was just worried that it was taking something of a superficial approach at first. That changed, and as I said, the 350 activists were really big about how they took this criticism. Okay, now here's a criticism of my position. You could say, all right, granted, divestment is purely symbolic. It's not actually attacking the fossil fuels industry's bottom line or their infrastructure, the way, say, fighting Keystone XL or fighting fracking or fighting mountaintop removal, attacks the infrastructure of the firms themselves. And 350.org is intimately and robustly involved in those struggles as well. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Say, okay, so divestment is a symbolic strategy, but symbolic strategies actually have their place. Were the lunch counter sit-ins in the South during segregation, did they help bring the white power structure in the South to its economic knees? No. They were highly symbolic. They were very material. People were using their bodies to disrupt business as usual. But ultimately what happened is they created, those sit-ins and all of the various tactics of the civil rights movement created a moral spectacle that reached an international stage. And it got in the way of John F. Kennedy's battle against global communism. And it became very hard for representatives of U.S. state power to go around the planet talking about freedom when there were images of black people being attacked by police dogs. And thus the federal government stepped in and forced the locals to change how they did things, such as the Voting Rights Act, crucial part of which has recently been overturned, limiting their ability to control local elections. So symbolic power can be important and meaningful. And I think that divestment can be part of that. Then that brings up the question, okay, so what should activists involved in divestment be demanding if you accept my argument that it doesn't hurt the bottom line of the fossil fuel industry because they make money selling their products, not selling stocks. Many of them don't even sell stocks. They don't actually generate money for investment very much from the stock market. Some firms do, in moments of crisis in the beginning, but by and large, most firms, not just in the fossil fuel industry, generate income for investment through specific bonds or through operating profits. ExxonMobil has been funding most of its expansion through its enormous profits. It's even been buying back stocks. If there's questions about why it doesn't hurt their bottom line, I can answer those later. But so what other types of demands could be made? And the divestment campaign has had some victories. It seems to me that rather than reinvesting in new and different equities, one of the demands could be, maybe should be, investing in the physical plant of institutions, investing in the physical plant of cities and universities, and taking that money out of markets and turning it into clean energy generation and electric vehicle charging stations and electric vehicle fleets right here in these universities. Brown University spends $10 million a year on electricity. Is that all sourced from totally carbon neutral sources of energy? I don't think it is. If you look at the green plans of most universities, they tend to be quite aspirational, and very little has been done so far. You look at the vehicle fleets of these universities. Okay, admittedly, they're not that big, but there are university systems with scores of buses and hundreds of vehicles that are being targeted with divestment, and none of them have a commitment that I could see from my research of going completely 100% renewable-based, fully electric. They have alternative fuel vehicles is the big thing. Alternative fuel vehicles, in many cases, are worse than fossil fuel vehicles. You turn fossil fuel into grain, which you then turn into ethanol. This becomes, or biodiesel. So I think that part of the question I'm getting at here is the idea of secondary demands. What else is on the table with divestment? What happens when universities and cities divest, as many have? Seattle, San Francisco, Madison, Boulder. What kind of really meaningful demands can be made around how these institutions consume energy and clean technology? And this, I think, is ultimately one of the crucial ways forward at this moment. We have a political deadlock in our country. We can't expect any kind of meaningful and robust legislation to come out of Congress. But here's the good news. We actually have the means to attack this problem at a national scale and therefore a global scale, because we're still the largest economy in the world. There is huge amounts of money ready to be invested. We have the technology, wind, solar, hydropower, and we have the laws at the national level. There is, corporate America is sitting on more uninvested cash than at any time since 1956. If it got proper cues from government, a lot of that cash could go into building out clean industry. The federal government itself could help jumpstart this, not with new programs and loans, but simply through clean purchasing. More than 1/3 of the U.S. economy is the public sector. This is not counting duplicate money that the feds give to the state. This is a point that anti-government right-wingers make great hay of. Grover Norquist always brings up the fact that the federal government is 25% of the national GDP. And progressives, liberals, environmentalists frequently shy away from this and don't respond. To my mind, that's actually part of the solution. Wait a minute. If more than 1/3 of the U.S. economy is, in theory, accountable to the citizenry, why aren't we demanding that the government, the public sector, consume clean energy, buy electric vehicles? The post office has 140,000 vehicles that the average of which travel 18 miles a day and park in the same place every night. There's no reason that fleet couldn't be electrified. Same with all these university fleets. If institutions started consuming clean power, it would help create economies of scale for the clean tech sector. And this gets back to this question of investment versus consumption. Investment is important, but really what clean energy producers and clean tech producers need right now, more than investments or loans, is they need customers. This has to do in part with the fact that natural gas has come online due to fracking and blown energy markets, blown the floor out of energy markets. Energy prices are dropping, and that means that commercial scale utilities are canceling wind projects. Numerous major wind turbine producers have gone into bankruptcy. Some of that has to do with cheap competition from China, but some of it has to do with the fact that energy from gas is so cheap, it's also displacing coal, but it's making it harder for the clean energy build-out. What that means is the clean tech sector needs customers. The public sector and institutions that are accountable, like Brown University, could play a very important role in helping to build out those markets by being consumers of clean energy. So this gets at this, the special role of institutions, and that gets us to the question of Duke power. The utilities are in an important position in all this. And under Jim Rogers, Duke Energy could have been a leader in moving towards clean energy, but unfortunately, it hasn't been. I don't know what his position on divestment. I assume he's going to say, don't divest because these companies need the space and the money to innovate. The utility firms, energy firms, they're the ones that are really going to lead the way, except that his didn't. He oversaw a $32 billion merger with Progress Energy, and making him the largest, Duke, the second largest utility in the country. The core area of its business, there are 7 million members who get the majority of their energy from coal-fired power plants. Duke, this might have changed in the last year, but until up through 2012, sourced 25% of its coal from Appalachian mountaintop removal source coal. I mean, just the worst way you could actually bring in coal. Duke Energy is a member of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which pushes at the state level for deregulation, pushes a whole sort of right-wing agenda, anti-union, anti-regulation, school privatization, but it involves pushing to undermine renewable portfolio standards at the state level, and these are state laws that require utilities that are going to sell electricity in their markets to increase the amount of energy that comes from carbon neutral sources. So Duke indirectly, by its membership in ALEC, has pushed against the kinds of regulations that would actually help create a clean energy revolution. And ultimately, this anti-government, pro-carbon agenda are intimately linked and have to be recognized as such. Duke's currently, for its core power users, supplies 0.2% of the electricity from carbon neutral renewable sources. The goal for 2032, from when Jim Rogers was CEO, was to boost that amount to 2.5%. That's not leadership. And institutions have a very special and important role. And so in the divestment struggle, I think people should think about, activists should think about, what are the secondary demands that leverage the special responsibility of institutions? And reinvestment ultimately the boundaries of that question should go beyond the equity markets, and we should really think about what are the concrete impacts that will be made by reinvestment. What can be done with all these buildings? Buildings consume 75% of the electricity in the US. They're responsible for 38% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Universities are, if nothing else, a bunch of buildings that are being heated and cooled, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to be done around these questions. I don't have all the answers, but those are my suggestions. That's a rehearsal of the critique I made, a critique of the critique I made, and I hope that makes sense and is useful for those of you who are involved in the divestment campaign. Thank you.
Now, Mr. James E. Rogers.
Good morning. Really glad, excuse me, really glad to see all of y'all here today. Look forward to talking to you about this subject, but I think it's very important, especially in the context of Christian's comments, that I set the stage by telling you where I come from. You can probably guess with my accent, but to tell you what our position is as a company. We're the largest utility in the United States. We're headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're either number 2 or number 3 in the consumption of coal and natural gas, as well as in the production of electricity from nuclear. We're the 5th largest generator of renewable energies from wind and solar. We are predominantly a seller and have an extensive network over 10 states of renewable energy. Personally, if you go back to 2009, Bill knows this because I was one of the few advocates in Washington supporting the Waxman-Markey bill to endorse and embrace cap and trade, putting a price on carbon, putting a cap on emissions, so that we can plan for the future. Because the power sector is the most capital-intensive industry in the world. The power industry builds power plants that last 40 years. So we have to look into the future. We have to look around the corner. We have to try to gauge what makes sense to build for the future. And I should say, in the last 5 years, we've spent $9 billion on new generation, predominantly gas-fired generation. And as a consequence of that, we are shutting down 90 old coal and oil units that are high-emitting and inefficient. We're modernizing our system for the future with an eye toward a price on carbon, even without any regulation in place, because smart businesses try to see the future and make investments to reflect what is coming in the future. So I think it's very important to have a clear vision of the future and to prepare for what's coming, even though it might not be the law today. When you got up this morning, you threw the switch to turn the light on, or you turned on your coffee machine or heated water for tea. How many of you thought, I wonder where that electricity is coming from? How many of you thought that this morning when you woke up and you threw the switch? You didn't, because electricity is back of mind. When you go buy a gallon of gas, do you know how much you pay per gallon? Raise your hand if you do. When you pay your electric, do you know how much you pay per kilowatt hour for electricity? Raise your hand if you do. Not so many. And so it's important to understand where your electricity comes from, but it's important to understand what you pay. Now, I would say, let's talk about coal divestiture as a policy. I would pose the question how effective it will be. Christian has written a really good article that says, in the Huffington Post, that basically makes the case, oven in itself, it will not be very effective. Because there are a lot of other things that are going on that's going to shape usage. So let me talk about the other things so y'all can put in context how valuable this will be at the end of the day in terms of changing behaviors in the United States, changing behaviors of people who throw the switch, changing behaviors of utility companies that are building new generation, change the behavior of coal companies when they don't sell it in the United States, they sell it to Germany, they sell it to China. Will it change behaviors? First of all, the most effective thing in this country to reduce coal use has been the discovery of shale gas. It has been the greatest innovation, technological innovation in the last decade. Prior to then, over 50% of the electricity in this country comes from coal. Today, only 37% comes from coal, and that's not the result of regulation. That's not a result of divestiture policy. That's the result of technological development of an independent gas producer, not a major oil company, being tough, using government technology, repurposing the technology, and has allowed us to become rich with a 100-year supply of natural gas. And as a consequence of this shale gas discovery and utilization, think about this fact. Our carbon emissions are back to where they were in 1992. We've almost achieved the Kyoto Protocol objective, and yet we have significantly more people than we did in this country in 1992, and our GDP is much larger, and yet we've achieved that through technological development. So a key to having a low carbon economy is to be able to invest in technology and utilize the technology. So we've made progress, and guess what? In Washington, where I've spent a lot of time, and I'm going after to our meeting today, in Washington, shale gas broke the paradigm because everybody in Washington argued the cleaner the fuel, the higher the cost. And what shale gas did, it says it's cleaner, but it has a lower price than coal. And for today, we're dispatching natural gas before we dispatch coal, and that's why there's been such a significant reduction in the emissions of CO2 in this country. Now, gas is not a perfect fuel. It's a bridge fuel. It has 50% of the carbon footprint. Most environmentalists argue convert from coal to gas. But at the end of the day, gas has 50% of the carbon footprint of coal. We ultimately are going to have to find a way to capture the carbon in natural gas if we continue to use it throughout this century. Then the question is, where is the coal going that's not being used in the United States? It's being shipped to China, it's being shipped to Germany, and we can have a conversation about Germany because it's leading the world in the build out of renewables, but they've shut down their nuclear and are shutting it down, and they are shutting down their gas plants, and they're building more coal plant to complement their wind and solar. And while the US has reduced its emissions of CO2, Germany, which is held up as a paradigm of greatness and with respect to renewables, they're actually seeing an increase in CO2 emissions, notwithstanding tripling their utility rates as they build out this renewable infrastructure in Germany. One other important point, we have to have a macro view. Climate change is not a US issue, it's a global issue. And I would say as the coal goes to China, and there's a lot of criticism of China because there's an important fact here. Between now and 2030, more than 80% of the carbon emissions in this country will come from developing countries. But China is a wonderful example. It's a good example and a bad example. It's a good example because they have lifted over 400 million people from poverty by giving them access to electricity. That's the first step in lifting people from poverty. And no country in the history of the world has been able to do what China has done. Now, they build a coal plant every week to do it. And now they have to clean it up, and they will clean it up, in my judgment. But it shows you the linkage between access to electricity and lifting people from poverty and building the middle class. The last thing I will say is, you sit here on the East Coast, and a lot of environmental policy comes from the East and West Coast. I just want to take a moment and say there is something between Providence and LA. And what is there is a part of our country where 25 states have more than 50% of the electricity come from coal. And you say, well, why did they do that? Well, part of it is they did it by thinking of the government policy going back to 1978. I look in this room, and I'm probably the only person here that remembers 1978 this clearly. Because in '78, we came out of the Arab oil embargo, and what happened? Our industry, about 20% of our electricity came from oil. The government said, wean yourself from oil. They then passed a law that said it's against the law to burn natural gas because it's a premium fuel. You can't burn it to generate electricity. No oil, no gas. And then what they said, build nuclear, build coal, we want to be energy independent. And so the people across the country who had access to coal, and in the South, where we had no gas, no coal, we built nuclear. And 50% of our electricity in the Carolinas comes from nuclear because we built what made sense. And that's another important thing to keep in mind as you craft policy. This is a geography question. Where you live and your access to fuels determines your position. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, if you're from West Virginia, you support the coal industry because it is so critical to the economy of the state. So I think it's very important. These issues are tough, but you have to have a nuanced and insightful view to be effective. Now, let me conclude by saying I have dealt with this issue, and I want to say something to you. I believe in having a portfolio of fuels that generate electricity. I believe we should have some coal, we should have gas, we should have nuclear, we should have renewables. In the fifth fuel, energy efficiency, that should be an important investment that we make. Because unlike the car industry that's totally dependent on oil, we have multiple ways to generate electricity. And keeping that, you hear President Obama go all of the above. And all of the above is important because we don't know what technology is going to be developed to allow us to use coal in an environmentally responsible way. We don't know what technology is going to develop to allow us to extract CO2 from coal or natural gas. We don't know about the new small modular reactors that are being tested or the new nuclear plants that are being built in China as they lead the world in the production of solar panels and wind turbines. We do not know, so having a portfolio, as in diversification of your assets and a portfolio you manage of your resources, is very critical. So I would say taking anything out of the portfolio is a mistake and reduces your flexibility over the long term. Now let me share my experience. I'm blessed and have the good fortune to serve on the International Board of the Nature Conservancy. I also serve on their finance committee. And I had this very issue presented to us: should we have a policy with respect to the divestiture of coal from our portfolio, consistent with our purpose going forward? First of all, when you're a portfolio manager for a university or for an organization like the Nature Conservancy, your first responsibility is to preserve and grow the principle for the future of the university or the organization that you are representing. So you have a deep fiduciary duty. So we struggled with this, and we came up with this policy, and we did adopt a policy. And the policy is this: we would make no investment in any company where more than 5% of their revenues or their income comes from the sale of coal, production and sale of coal. We went a step further and said we will not invest in any utility who plans to build a new coal plant given the current technological capability to extract carbon from coal plants. And that to me sounded like a reasoned approach to address the issue and was consistent with our mission. And it's an incremental approach at some level, but it recognizes something, and this is the last thought I'll leave with you. When you think about energy issues, when you think about managing a portfolio, when you think about the energy infrastructure of our country, you must embrace cathedral thinking. What is that? And I'll give you one example. I recently took my granddaughter to Paris, and we were at Notre Dame, and had a guide, and they were telling us the history. But when you look at how that was built over 100 years, the architect who drew it, the plans, never saw it finished. The people who worked on the foundation their entire life never saw the walls or the stained glass windows. Those that worked on the walls and stained glass windows never saw the spires. And even those that saw it finished never saw all the prayers, the weddings, the funerals, the experiences of the people there for hundreds of years afterwards. Yet 4 generations dedicated their life to building this. They had vision, they had faith, and they had a belief that what they were doing in their life would make a difference, not just today, but for future generations. So as you think about these issues, employ cathedral thinking and think about the implications, not just for you, but for future generations. Thank y'all very much.
Finally, we have Bill McKibben.
Thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today, but let me begin by saying that in a certain way, this debate should be unnecessary. For the last several years, students here at Brown have pursued divestment from coal. That is a moderate request, far more moderate than the one that 350 has made for total fossil fuel divestment. A more aggressive demand that's already been met by colleges across the country, cities from Seattle to Providence, and major religious denominations. Here, students have gone carefully through the appointed bureaucratic system, and the Advisory Committee on Investments has strongly recommended divestment. In the past, this recommendation has always been followed, but in this case, the administration has twice asked for clarification, as if this was a problem where urgency was not paramount. But urgency will be the watchword of my remarks. In fact, apologies if I seem to be speaking too quickly. I've got a lot to get through. I salute the students who have made this issue real here at Brown and wish one of them had been allowed to join us up on the stage, but I'll do my best to explain why their request makes both practical sense and is morally urgent. Point 1, coal is gruesome. Its direct health effects are enormous. The first study we have of fossil fuel deaths worldwide, which came out last September, estimates that there'll be 100 million deaths from fossil fuel by 2030, the vast bulk of them from coal. This damage is, of course, concentrated among the poorest people who live near power plants, but it affects us all. If you want to know why you can't eat fish from lakes in New England, it's because of the pollution coming out of the top of smokestacks at places like Duke. Point 2, the greater danger it presents is to our climate. Last Friday's report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it clear that we cannot burn the vast majority of the coal that companies on this divestment list and their ilk plan to burn if we are to grapple successfully with climate change. Jim Hansen, our most important climatologist, has repeatedly shown why we must be out of the business of burning coal by 2030 to have any hope of stabilizing the climate. That calls for immediate, powerful action. So far, we have melted the Arctic, or at least 80% of its summer sea ice. So far, we've taken the Atlantic here and every other ocean on Earth and made them 30% more acidic. So far, we've taken the planet out of the Holocene by raising the temperature a degree. As the IPCC made clear, without emergency action, that 1 degree will be 3 or 4 degrees before the youngest people in this room are our age. This is by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done, and preventing it requires not just normal effort, but maximal effort, and fast. 4 decades from now, the cathedral is going to be underwater, okay? Point 3. The fossil fuel companies and utilities are not moving with anything like the required speed. They're on their own timeline trying to maximize profit. Duke is a good example. Even in the years after the last 3 IPCC reports made it clear the danger we were in, Duke decided to go ahead and build new coal-fired power plants. It lags behind its 11 peer utilities in getting off coal. It has the most modest plans for renewable energy. Its integrated resource plan released last year shows that by 2030, when Jim Hansen said we'd need to be off coal altogether, about 2.25% of power in North Carolina, its service district, will come from wind and sun. This is absurd. We talked about coasts. I mean, as far as on my map, North Carolina is just as much on the coast as Rhode Island. And in fact, the Department of Energy has estimated that some of probably the best wind resources in the country are off the coast of North Carolina, and would be sufficient to meet 100% of the state's needs. An independent study conducted by Ventix, a consulting firm, found that Duke could be off coal entirely by 2020 by investing aggressively in wind, sun, and conservation. What would the net cost to ratepayers be? They'd save $108 billion, or 57% of their bills. That's in contrast with the Duke of today, which has just asked for a rate increase to cover the cost of its new plans. Mr. Rogers deserves great credit for his rhetoric, but not for his actions. That's why that radical magazine, Business Week, called him the smooth-talking king of coal. This is really important that we get this right. Point 4, we could be getting it right much more quickly, fast enough to matter. Here's what Citigroup said recently. Citigroup, again, not exactly a radical source. What is clear to us is that the perception of solar is inefficient is no longer accurate, a fact that is not being fully appreciated by the utility sector. In our view, as we clearly show, solar is already cheaper in many countries, with others very close behind, including the United States, with several states showing socket or retail parity, and they cited Georgia, Arizona, New Mexico, countries not concentrated along the coast. In fact, we could go much farther. A University of Delaware study in January of this year found that 90% of the grid could be powered by solar and wind by 2030, and that it would halve the cost of electricity for consumers. The Delaware team created a computer model that tested 28 billion combinations of renewable energy sources and storage mechanisms. Sure, and it stripped away all subsidies for renewable energy. They found that we could provide 99.9% of demand by 2030 with no increase in cost at all. Instead, Mr. Rogers offers us the promise of shale gas, which indeed is increasing. The trouble is that it's not a bridge fuel. The trouble is that as we reduce carbon emissions in this country, we are clearly increasing methane emissions at an enormous rate. Today, the news from today is that the latest IPCC data shows that methane is 25% more potent in trapping heat than we had thought even a year ago. And so the damage in the calculation gets worse and worse. Point 5, coal-fired utilities are doing their best to prevent dramatic change like this because they fear the effect on the bottom line. Business Week again. There are 3,200 utilities that make up the U.S. electric grid. It's a model that's changed little since Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and it's doomed to obsolescence. What they don't like is the distributed generation, decentralized, homegrown green energy, because as Business Week says, it poses a mortal threat to their profit model. And so the industry is fighting back. They're trying to roll back net metering. The battle in Arizona is particularly intense right now. And in other ways, hinder the transition to new sources of power. Mr. Rogers, for instance, was on the board of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce till he was term limited out in 2010. During his tenure, the Chamber not only fought all attempts to do anything about climate change, but it filed a brief with the EPA insisting that it would be all right if the temperature warmed dramatically because humans would, quote, adapt their physiology and behavior to the new climate. Duke Energy, as Christian says, belongs to ALEC, which is busy fighting the classification of coal ash as hazardous waste. Duke has some of the biggest piles of coal ash on the planet. Duke belongs to the Electricity Reliability Coordinating Council, which has even fought the mercury rule, the most sort of basic of pollution rules. 2 weeks ago, the EPA took a very modest step towards regulating carbon from coal-fired power plants, and they were immediately denounced by Duke for doing it. They want the old world to hang on longer, far longer than science tells us it can. Point 6, divestment is an effective way to fight this kind of abuse and to speed up action. Normally, that we would turn to things like shareholder activism, but for 25 years, this has been ineffective. In place after place, it has not produced change at the speed with which that change needs to go. The reason is that there's not a flaw in the business plan of these industries. The flaw is the business plan that calls for only 2 or 3% solar and wind generation at Duke, say, by 2030. So on occasion, divestment, severing of ties, making a profound moral statement is required. Brown has done this on a couple of occasions, South Africa being maybe the prominent example. And in that case, it was enormously effective. Not, as Christian points out, by going straight to the bottom line. We cannot bankrupt Exxon or Duke or anybody else. Our goal is to politically bankrupt them, to have some effect. Remember when Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first trip he took was to the US, and he did not go first to the White House. He went first to California to thank students in the UC system who had forced the divestment of $3 billion worth of stock. He said, "We liberated ourselves, but we could not have done it without you." It was Mandela's great accomplice, Desmond Tutu, who asked us, one of the voices rising up to ask for divestment from fossil fuel. As he said last year, if you could see the drought and the famine plaguing Africa as a result of climate change, even though we burn less than 1% of fossil fuel on the planet, you would understand why I have asked you to take up these tools again. Point 8. Divestment is not, as Christian points out correctly, the only strategy we need, and we're grateful to him for reminding us of that, and we try to be cognizant of it. 350.org has spearheaded the fight on Keystone. It's helped battle coal ports to prevent the flow of coal, as Jim points out, overseas. It works on mountaintop removal, Arctic drilling. Our activists demand renewable portfolio standards, net metering, and end to subsidies for fossil fuel, and the reinvestment of divested money in all sorts of good things. And of course, we're far from the only group at work in this. You know, groups like the Sierra Club have just announced huge plans to fight for just the kind of fleet purchases and things that Christian recommends. It is a sprawling movement, and it needs to be, because it is up against the richest companies on earth, a financial force so powerful that it is very difficult to stand up to them. Just to give you an example, the entire budget of 350.org, which works in 181 countries around the world, with 50 young people on its staff and tens of thousands of volunteers, our entire budget is less than half of what Duke paid Mr. Rogers last year to be its CEO. Those are the kind of imbalances that we're at work on, which leads me to the final point, point 9. This is why we need universities above all to take stands, to work with us. We need institutions where ideas matter to take on an actual stand. Yes, it's true, Alex, that there are many sides to every question, but sometimes in the end you actually have to come down and make a decision, take a stand, do a dichotomous thing, speak up for that which you believe. Universities are important because it's places like this where we learn the truth about climate change. It's in the research labs of great American universities that we came to understand the greatest problem that the planet has ever faced. Therefore, it's places like this that carry a special burden to act on it. Beyond that, it's the reputation of places like Brown that make you important. As Tom Steyer, the great investor who's been a leader in this divestment fight after divesting his own holdings from fossil fuel. As he said, speaking to college trustees, your decision one way or another on this matter is a statement of who you are as a college, what your mission is. A strong and well-defined mission is an incredibly valuable thing for a college or any institution. Your mission is your advantage, and you have to decide whether that includes cooperating with people doing apartheid in South Africa, whether it includes cooperating with the forces that are warming the world, so on and so forth. The final reason that it is so important that universities do this is that there is no place where the intergenerational dilemma posed by climate change is more important. Most of the time at universities like this one or the one where I work, the basic model is old people teach young people things, okay? And that's appropriate. The idea is that we've acquired some wisdom and passed it along. But in this case, that logic is turned on its head in many ways. Most of us will be dead before the worst of climate change completely kicks in. But for people coming of age now, if we do not tackle this problem and tackle it with far, far more ferocity than our government or Duke or anybody else has shown in taking this on, then the lives of those young people will be dramatically reduced and degraded as their lives wear on. By the time that they should be in the prime of their careers, much of their work, as the scientists tell us, will be devoted to nothing but emergency response to the kind of ongoing horror that we see around us more and more all the time. And so this is one of the cases where people of the age of those in the administration or on the board of trustees need to defer to the need, the desire, and the well-educated demand of younger people to do the right thing, and not to do it sometime down the future, to do it now. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. So now we're going to move into Q&A. We have a little over half an hour for questions. The way we're going to do it is we have some mobile microphones. So in order to get everybody involved, I'm going to ask for questions based on who the question is directed to. You can ask general questions, but if you do have a question directed towards one of our speakers, we're going to be going the same order we started. So we'll be starting with Mr. Parenti. I know we have a lot of really impassioned people here, which is great. I don't want to have to shout anyone down, so just be respectful. That's the only thing. All right, so who has a question for Mr. Parenti? Over here.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Rachel. So, Mr. Parenti, in your article in the Huffington Post, you state, "I am all for dumping carbon stocks, if for no other reason than a sense of decency and honor." And if we recognize that divestment is not the only way that institutions can combat climate change, I'm wondering, in light of this, your own moral standard, what does it say if our university votes no to divesting? What does it say if our university votes no to divesting? What message does that send?
I'll use this. What would it say? Well, it would say that they don't take this problem seriously and that they're highly irresponsible and that they suffer from a type of false consciousness about what the science says. Sorry, I said it would be the height of irresponsibility for Brown not to divest. And my point was that because of the urgency that
Sorry, everybody.
it would be the height of irresponsibility not to divest. And it's because of the urgency that Bill laid out and the science lays out that I was concerned about, okay, well, what else? What besides this? Because there is a tendency in American activism to settle for the symbolic. This goes back to Thoreau, right? I mean, Thoreau wasn't really trying to get at slavery and stop the war in Mexico. He was trying to wash his honor. There's something to that, but we need to do more than that because of the crisis, and we actually have much more at our disposal than we realize. If you look at stuff like, oh, $10 million a year spent on electricity, where does the electricity come from? What are the vehicle fleets? Why are all these buildings not being retrofitted? That should be part of the secondary demands. Brown has the money to do all that, and you guys have to make them, not just divest and then send it back into the markets, but you got to get them to lead physically, to create economies of scale for clean technology so that it can compete in the open market with dirty technology. And if that happens, then we can see this transition. One piece of this, I realized I forgot something. I said, we have the money, we have the technology, we also have the laws. One of the key laws, which Duke Energy has struggled to undermine, is the Clean Air Act, right? So Massachusetts versus EPA is a very important case that requires the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We're waiting for many, many rules to be issued from this to impose essentially a de facto carbon tax. This is going to happen. And it's in that context that purchasing and reinvestment in the physical plant to make it all greener by universities could really add up and help push us in the next decade towards the clean energy future that is a minimal requirement for facing these challenges.
All right, so now we'll be taking questions for Mr. Rogers. Right there. Yeah, next to you.
Thank you for being here. I'm wondering, Mr. Rogers, if Duke Energy would consider replacing all of its coal and natural gas generation with nuclear, which you're already in, and possibly offshore wind.
Come on, I'm going to try this. I think this works. No, good question. I think that
I think you should probably use this.
if you remember how I started my conversation with our mission to be affordable, reliable, and increasingly clean 24/7, 365 days a year, our goal line, the toughest part of our job is to maintain affordability and reliability and clean. I could shut down 40% of my plants, but there would be a lot of homes and businesses that would not have electricity, and that would have a devastating impact on those families and on those businesses. And that's why I kept making the point, any transition we make is made over long term. Now, Ed has kind of made the point that you haven't done wind and solar in North Carolina, and he's quoting our IRP from North Carolina. But the reality is, if you put a wind map over the state, you put a solar map over the state, that's not the best place to build wind or solar, except maybe you could build the wind around our state capitol, because our politicians talk a lot, and it might generate a little wind. But my only point here is, we're number 5 in the country in wind and solar production, but we're building it where the wind blows. We build it in Texas where the sun shines and makes it economic to provide electricity. And we can't forget that. The offshore thing, we've looked at length. Actually, we tried a project. We were blocked by the Army Corps of Engineers. And the reality is, it's not as easy as it sounds to build a transmission line, because there are a lot of environmentalists in our state that do not want to see wind turbines. Same way in Nantucket and Cape Cod, they do not want to see wind farms offshore. And I guarantee you in the mountains where the wind blows, and I have a house in the mountains, nobody wants the ridge lines with wind turbines on the ridge lines. So important point I would make is we're making the transition. You can't do this overnight. And let me say this, 50% of our electricity in North Carolina and South Carolina is carbon free. 70%, because it's nuclear. 70% of our carbon-free electricity in this country comes from nuclear. And my bet is these guys are against nuclear. But it's the only way you can generate electricity 24/7 and be carbon-free. So it's about economics, it's about timing, it's about shutting down in an appropriate way, and it's not inconsequential that we have shutting down 90 old coal and oil plants. Let me say one last thing, if I may, quickly. You know, I'm struck. I'm sitting in the middle. And I've been very polite because I'm Southern. But I've got somebody on the left and I got somebody on the right, and they feel like the debate is about attacking Duke. That's not what this debate's about. This debate is whether or not you should divest stock that generates revenues from the production of coal. I have to quickly say this in defense. For Christian to even imply, I'm insulted that we wouldn't be in compliance with the Clean Air Act and we're trying to undermine it, that's just flat wrong. The second thing is these guys love renewables. Go to Germany, where they built 70 megawatts out of a total demand of 80 megawatts. They've tripled the cost of electricity, and they're subsidizing on residential, and they're shifting the subsidy to industrial, and yet they're burning coal, and they've raised their CO2 output. I've never heard so many half-truths said so fast, because at the end of the day, let's focus on the issue at hand rather than an attack on me or an attack on Duke. I'd rather see them have the courage and the courtesy to focus on the issue here today. Thank you all very much.
And now questions for Mr. McKibben?
Sure. Let's think for a minute about...
No, we're taking questions.
Well, you know what? I mean, it's... You don't want to have any interplay among this stuff?
You can do a rebuttal briefly
Sure.
at the start of the question.
It's just on points of fact. I'm looking right now at the federal government's work on offshore wind on North Carolina. They estimate 58 gigawatts, or 130% of the state's energy demands, in fact, projected to grow over the next 20 years. They're getting all of that. The Sierra Club here, the biggest environmental organization in North Carolina, is fully in favor of doing this. As with Nantucket, the opposition comes not from environmentalists, it comes from a few rich people who don't want to look at windmills, but that is overcomeable. And it's been overcome in Nantucket, and it'd be overcome in a place like North Carolina if people got to work on it. Now, in the second place, this talk
We do
about...
have to move on to the question.
Well, I
I'm sorry.
will, but this, don't you want to have the discussion? The talk about Germany is important, okay? Germany...
Everyone else is getting the opportunity to respond to questions. We can do rebuttals.
No,
and
it's
you
right.
can include
It's right.
rebuttal
I'm fine,
in your
whatever.
response. Sorry about that. So who has a question for Mr. McKibben? No one? Oh, we got one in the back.
Right next to him.
So thank you, all three of you, for coming today. Super informative. So in all of the talk of cathedral thinking, there seemed to be, on Mr. Rogers' part, a glaring omission of any mention of climate change. And speaking of half-truths, of course, I commend his lobbying for Waxman-Markey. He neglected to mention that he summarily killed McKay and Lieberman because it did not align with Duke's business interests. But he seems to want to strike a deal with the habitability of large swaths of the planet at stake. Duke should be given an imprimatur to improve on their 0.2% of electricity from carbon-neutral sources. And by the way, Duke is far and away the most progressive of the coal companies that ACRIP has recommended the university divest from. So, Mr. McKibben, given this omission, I thought you might
If you could hold the
speak-
mic a little bit farther away, because
Yeah, sorry. Given this omission, I thought you might speak a little more to what the city of Providence might face under the latest IPCC climate scenarios and how this informs the ethical decision of Brown to divest. Because as Brown Corporation has made clear, what this decision comes down to is ethics.
So that's a very good question, and it brings us back into the question of reality. And there's been a lot of discussion of reality and the reality of markets and how much people are going to pay for what, and so on and so forth. The basic reality here is the reality of physics, and it's a reality that's very difficult to escape. When you warm the planet, the oceans begin to rise. First, that's because warm water takes up more space than cold water, and so there's a kind of thermal expansion. After that, it comes quickly from the melt of polar ice and glacial ice. That's why we think that sea levels will go up at least 3 feet, considerably more perhaps in the course of this century, and then continue on for many centuries afterward. That's a big deal. The water off New York Harbor was 1 foot higher than it was 100 years ago when Hurricane Sandy hit, and you saw what happened. The New York City subway system filled up with the Atlantic Ocean. It's possible that New York will be able to spend enough money to defend some of that for a little while. It's impossible that the same will happen in Bangladesh, in India, in the myriad other places where coastlines are already disappearing and people in large numbers are being forced on the move by climate change. There is no defense for this kind of thing. And so ethically, the idea that Brown should be invested in it is troubling. It's especially troubling since in this case, there's not even any need to make a financial sacrifice. All the evidence that we have indicates that, that if you divested whole hog from fossil fuels 10 years ago, and billion-dollar endowment, according to an independent study by the AP, would have been yielded $119 more million in the intervening decade. Think how many scholarships that would provide. As the proud parent of a Brown student, I can tell you exactly how many tuitions that would pay if you want. The point is that in this case, there's no reason, even if you were just thinking in the narrowest selfish terms, not to move. But the fact that there is a strong ethical imperative to do so is very clear. And do not be scared that you're somehow going to be shutting people out of power or making life impossible the way it is in Germany, a country with probably the strongest economy in the world, with an unemployment rate of 3%, the highest estimate I've seen for the number of people who could potentially be forced to have trouble paying for their electric bills in Germany is 600,000, and I can give you the site if you want. Duke was shutting off 500 people a day in 2008 for non-payment of service. That's about 180,000 a year in one state or two-state region in one part of this country. So the idea that somehow people are going to starve in Germany because they've made a commitment to renewable power is simply wrong. My prediction is Germany is going to eat our lunch technologically and come out the absolute winner in a world that takes this stuff seriously.
Thank you. So now, if we have any questions for Mr. Parenti. We have one in the way back.
This is just a question for a point of clarification. I believe in Germany, the problem in those two states is due to the fact that the prior sources of energy were closed before they had a chance to connect the wind farms to the grid. So that basically, once that issue was cleared up, you won't be seeing the problems you currently see. Is that correct? Did I read that wrong?
I'm not quite hearing everything you're saying. You're saying that the problem in Germany was the lack of connectivity between the new renewables coming online.
The wind farms in the Baltic.
You're asking, essentially what you're asking is why is Germany importing any coal? Essentially.
Yes, I'm asking, no.
Basically Germany has built out an enormous renewable energy sector, and it continues to do that, but the people of Germany do not support atomic power, and so they have voted to close their atomic plant. Fukushima has had a devastating effect on the atomic power industry all over the world, and the Germans are moving off of atomic. They were in the wake of Chernobyl, so they don't want that form of power. And there is, unfortunately, a bit of an increase in their consumption of coal. That's going to go down as they continue to build out the renewables. Part of how they built out the renewables was they had a very aggressive feed-in tariff, which meant that you could not just give power back to the grid, you could sell power back to the grid. And this has been tremendously successful. This has been one of the most important things globally for the renewable energy industry, was that the feed-in tariff from Germany. In terms of atomic power too, since that's one thing that came up, if utilities want to build atomic power, go for it, but don't expect any public subsidies. As it is now, the federal government will guarantee only up to 80% of the costs of loans for new plants. And that still makes it very, very hard for this nuclear renaissance we're supposedly hearing about. Okay, there's this one plant in the thoroughly regulated South. They were not deregulated the way California was, because deregulation was such a disaster. So in the South, you get this cost plus structure. So you can pass on cost overruns. You try and build a nuke plant somewhere else and you try and borrow money to do it, it's just not happening. In the meantime, what utilities are doing is they're getting up rates and they're extending the licenses of these old plants, many of which are leaking. Don't believe me, believe the former head of the NRC, Jasko, who after leaving the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said he thought the majority of the plants should be closed down because they're so dirty. And I dispute the claim that we're attacking you personally. I mean, you represent a huge institution. We're talking about institutions. And I would expect the CEO of a major utility not to be so thin-skinned. This isn't about people. This is about institutions and what they're going to do.
Now questions for Mr. Rogers. We have one in the front here. Or never mind.
Hi. In a May NPR story that covered the Brown Divest coal campaign, a Duke Energy spokesperson, Tom Williams was his name, said that Duke did not want to lose any investors, especially through a public divestment. He went on to say that, quote, "People consider the brand of Duke as an asset, and I would agree with that completely. And if people see that the brand is somehow eroded in a meaningful way, that definitely can impact our stock." So throughout the Divest Coal campaign, there's been those arguing that divestment does not send a powerful message, but this was clearly an admission by a Duke spokesperson to the contrary. So given this, how do you think that divestment would affect Duke Energy's brand image?
Well, first of all, I might have to get that. First of all, Duke is on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index in the United States, and for many years we were on the worldwide Sustainability Index, in part for our practices. And I would urge you to go to our website and see our sustainability report. We've probably been producing a sustainability report for over a decade, probably longer than any other company in our sector. I didn't totally hear the quote from Tom Williams, and so I don't know how to react to it. Could you say it again and kind of hold the microphone away? I apologize, I just didn't hear.
Yeah, the acoustics in this room are a little weird, so just try and speak clearly and hold the mic not
Sorry,
too
what part
close.
did you want to hear? What part? The quote? Okay, the
The
quote
quote.
was, "People consider the brand of Duke as an asset, and I would agree with that completely. And if people see that the brand is somehow eroded in a meaningful way, that definitely can impact our stock."
And brand really matters to us. I mean, think about it. We're on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. That's branding. Not many utilities are on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index first. Yeah, and not many utilities are on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. The second thing is, we're a company that supported Waxman-Markey in 2009 because we recognize that global warming is real and that man-made emissions are contributing, and that we have a special responsibility to address that issue, and that's why we supported that legislation during that period of time. The third thing, and I mentioned it earlier, our actions speak louder than any words. When you shut down 90 old coal and oil plants and replace it with new, modern, efficient gas-fired plants, that's a fundamental transformation of your fleet, and it isn't small change to spend $9 billion to change it out. And yes, we built a coal plant, but it's the cleanest coal plant in the world, and it was an example of deploying a new technology because we believe in the power of technology to solve our carbon problem and to help us mitigate the emissions of carbon by using technology. But we are so far into the emissions of CO2 around the world, and given the significant increase, over 80% coming from the developing world, we need to start putting money and research and energy and the development of technology into addressing the issue of mitigating the impacts of global warming, because we're already past the time. So as a company, if I can go through a long list of things that we have done. We've reduced 95% of the emissions of mercury from our coal plants, and what we emit is de minimis in terms of the total mercury that's in the environment. So we, as a company, have a history of leading on important issues in different jurisdictions. And let me say one last thing about Germany, because I don't want to leave the room with a misimpression. You study Germany. I've studied Germany. You can Google this and you can say, Rogers either got it or he didn't get it. But since they've gone down this road on wind and solar, yes, they've shut down their nuclear plants, but they flip-flopped on it a couple times before they got to where they are, and they're not all shut down yet. But their rates are 3 times the rates at 35 cents a kilowatt hour of the rates here in the United States, which the average rate is 10 cents. The second thing is they did develop...
I'm going to have to cut you off. I'm sorry.
I'm just saying that's...
You can keep it, if you can keep it short.
Okay. But the important point is affordability matters. And the other thing that matters is, I think, is just getting the balance right. And I wish I could give you a slogan answer to every question, but we try to do meaningful things that uphold our brand, but don't diminish our brand.
So we've got 10 minutes left for the last few questions. I just want to remind everybody that even though the Duke discussion and the Germany discussion are great, we're here to discuss divestment. So if we can stay on that topic. So now questions for Mr. McKibben, and preferably from this side of the room. We've been hearing from this side a lot. Hands? Well, I guess we have one down. Oh, one sec, we had to bring the other mic up here.
Hi, can you just elaborate on your statement that 100 million deaths are due to coal?
Sure. So find you the report probably. It's not due to coal, it's due to fossil fuel in general, but the bulk of that is coming from coal, and the bulk of it, of course, is coming now in the third world. That's why people in the developing world, why the biggest task is to leapfrog past the industrial coal age straight into the renewable energy age. We no longer have this sort of time for a kind of bridge fuel that we used to talk about because people wasted the last 25 years. What we have to do now is go to the sun and the wind, and happily, those developing countries are precisely the place where the odds are highest of being able to do that most easily. I mean, North Carolina has terrific wind and sun resources, but happily, India has even better wind and sun resources. And India is probably the next great chapter here along the way. So one hopes that that's precisely the kind of technology we'll get. But you'll find the report if you Google DAFRA, D-A-F-R-A report. It was commissioned by the 20 poorest countries in the world, and it was part of their campaign to get countries like ours to get off fossil fuel quickly, drawing attention to exactly how deep this problem is.
So we have time for one more question, and I want to make sure every speaker has a chance to respond to this last one. So if someone has a general question.
That'd be great.
Okay, so anyone can answer this. It's basically, are we pursuing things in the right order? Like, is divestment the thing we should be doing first, or should we be coming up with an alternative to what happens after we divest? Because it seems like I agree with a lot of what Mr. Rogers said, that everyone who's in decision-making roles. I agree with a lot of what Mr. Rogers said, that everyone who's in decision-making roles in Washington and places like that see natural gas as the clean solution to coal. And when we, at like Brown University and other universities, pursue a divestment from coal policy, I'm worried that it kind of leads to investment in natural gas infrastructure, which I don't see as a better solution. So I think it upsets me a little bit that the Brown Divest Coal campaign is the most organized and well-run environmental group at Brown, instead of having people who are pursuing what I would say as productive projects, things that work for renewable alternatives, energy efficiency, things like that. So I guess if any of you can speak to whether divestment should be the first thing we're doing.
We can reverse the way we started and go that way. So we can.
It shouldn't be the only thing that you do. In fact, Brown has done some interesting things. This was one of the places with the earliest, one of the earliest environmental studies departments in the country, and it has a long and strong tradition there. If you go to the Brown is Green homepage, you'll see a long list of the sustainability initiatives that the college has undertaken. Those are good. We are past the point where we're going to solve climate change, though, one good project at a time on scattered campuses around the country. We're at the place where we need structural reform of systems, and that comes when we're able to apply political pressure, when we're able to reduce the political power of those companies and forces that have blocked significant action for a generation now, and who continue to do it. That's why, among other steps, Brown should take this one. It's not the only thing one should do, and it actually isn't that hard. Your advisory committee on responsible investment policy recommended doing it last year, and for some reason the administration just keeps, sending it back for, a little more tweaking and fine-tuning. But actually, take it, get on with things, and go on to other things would be my advice.
I think you're right in terms of a multiple approach. Clearly, energy efficiency. I mean, I look at this building and I'm going, probably not. It's a beautiful building, but I bet it's not as energy efficient as it could be. But putting more dollars, having the university do that into energy efficiency is a good thing. I know, because I know the ACC, they have a contest among all the schools to see who can reduce their carbon footprint the most. So that's kind of a healthy, competitive thing. It's in addition to basketball and football and other things, but it's just another field to compete on. The other thing that you could do, if you really want to make a difference, I would mobilize people on this campus to go to the state legislature. I'd mobilize people on this campus to go to the state regulators to get the right regulatory regimes in place where you can have real change in real time. And an incremental change in investment policy at one university, and even if it's at all universities, is not going to make a significant difference in the long scheme of things. What makes a difference is changing the laws, changing the regulations, which will change the behavior of the regulated companies and other companies in the state. And my last point is, I've offered an alternative to the university consider, one that was adopted by the Nature Conservancy, that I think is a reasoned approach that allows you to have a policy, but one that is carefully balance the interest going forward.
So, I mean, I clearly, I think, that there needs to be stuff other than divestment underway. I mean, clearly divestment is gaining some victories. So that question of secondary demands is now quite pressing, and it requires some creative thinking. I don't have all the answers for it, but I think we need to try and mobilize the consumption of institutions. The consumption of institutions like Brown, but you add it up to all the other universities, 300 different universities facing this, it adds up to something. It's not the same as the whole public sector, buying clean energy, buying electric vehicles, but it's meaningful. I also think that the divestment struggle should be linked to, and as an individual, let me just interrupt myself, as an individual, you got to choose which one you're engaged in. But I think it's really important also to attack the fossil fuel industry's infrastructure. That really helps raise costs directly. Try and shut down fracking. I mean, fracking is horrible directly because it's polluting the water. There's all this fugitive methane, but also what it's doing to energy markets is basically like hammering renewables in the knees. Renewables are doing well nonetheless, but they're, we have major, as I said, wind turbine companies and producers in bankruptcy because of natural gas. So I think that individually people have to make their own choices, and as part of a movement, that this question of secondary demands is now really coming to the fore, and it's something that the divestment movement has to get out in front of, and I'm very sure that they will. And the one thing I will say for divestment, even though I've been critical of it, is that what it does is sets up an antagonistic relationship. And that, I think, is important. There's a danger of seeing this as a technical problem. It's not. This is a political problem. We have the money, we have the technology, we do not have the political will to make the changes we need to make. And cooperating and viewing this as a technical problem and working on the university's sustainability plan, that could be a swamp where you just get lost in pointless meetings and you come up with a slightly better version of the plan than you currently have. And what needs to be done is pressure has to be put on the people who make decisions so that they do things that are currently uncomfortable and anathema to them, because that is what has to be done. And I think that the antagonistic position of the divestment movement helps set that up. So it's like, what are you guys going to do? You're going to divest? You're not going to divest? If you divest, what else are you going to do? If you're not going to divest, what are you going to do to justify yourselves? And that you should all keep pressing very hard on that front.
So I want to say a final word, but please give all of our speakers a round of applause. They all did a fantastic job. Just one last thing, and I'll let you guys go. Like I said, this is an unusual event for us. We don't usually have events that are so specific to Brown. And Janus really exists to foster conversation and communication and bring ideas together, but that's not our end game. Our end game is to really get you to think about it and to decide how you feel. And so part of that necessarily involves voicing your opinions. So you can think what you want, but you should really put it out there. The corporation is going to be deciding on divestment this October, and whether you're for it or against it, you should tell somebody. You should tell the president, you should tell UCS, get your voice out there. It's really important. So thanks very much. Thanks for coming. This was a really great event.